Karen said I was too dirty. I just got back from disaster relief. The red-eye flight back to Meadowbrook had been a blur of fitful sleep and the low hum of the airplane engines. Every muscle in my body ached, a dull, persistent throb that was a familiar souvenir from the past 2 weeks. My hands, despite multiple scrubbings, still bore faint traces of the dust and grime that had permeated everything in Cypress Creek Parish, Louisiana. The air there had been thick with the smell of damp earth, decaying vegetation, and the faint lingering scent of diesel fuel from the heavy machinery. It was a smell that clung to your clothes, your hair, even the inside of your nostrils, a constant reminder of the devastation the hurricane had wrought. I had volunteered with the Red Cross, joining the throngs of people who had descended upon the ravaged communities, eager to offer any help we could. My background in emergency medical services had been invaluable, but even the simplest tasks, distributing water, sorting supplies, offering a comforting word, had taken on a profound significance in the face of such widespread loss. We had worked tirelessly, day and night, fueled by adrenaline and a shared sense of purpose. The sheer scale of the destruction, a constant, heavy weight on our hearts. Returning home to the pristine normalcy of Meadowbrook felt surreal. The manicured lawns, the quiet streets, the predictable rhythm of suburban life. It was a stark contrast to the chaos and raw human emotion I had just witnessed. My own home, thankfully untouched by the storm, felt almost alien in its cleanliness and order. I longed for a long, hot shower and the simple comfort of my own bed, but a few essential errands couldn't wait. My refrigerator was bare, and I desperately needed to pick up some groceries. It was at the local fresh foods market, a place usually synonymous with organic produce and polite interactions, that I had my first encounter with the infamous Karen Mitchell. Her reputation as Meadowbrook's quintessential HOA Karen preceded her like a meticulously crafted but ultimately unwelcome neighborhood newsletter. Tales of her unwavering enforcement of lawn height regulations, her vehement complaints about acceptable holiday decorations, and her general air of self-appointed moral and aesthetic superiority were well circulated within the community. I had managed to avoid a direct interaction with her until now, but fate, it seemed, had other plans. I was in the produce aisle, my eyes scanning the vibrant displays of fruits and vegetables, still feeling slightly disoriented by the fluorescent lighting after weeks spent under the harsh Louisiana sun. My clothes, the same comfortable but well-worn jeans and t-shirt I had traveled in, were undoubtedly showing the wear and tear of my recent work. There was a faint smudge of what I hoped was dirt on my cheek, and my hair, usually neatly pulled back, was likely a bit unruly. I hadn't had the energy for much more than a cursory wash at the airport. As I reached for a bag of avocados, a voice sharp and laced with unmistakable disapproval cut through the gentle murmur of shoppers. "Excuse me, excuse you, some of us are trying to shop in a clean environment." I turned to see Karen Mitchell standing a few feet away, her face a mask of distaste. Her perfectly coiffed blonde hair gleamed under the store lights, and her immaculate white linen pantsuit looked as though it had just been pressed. Her designer sunglasses perched on her nose, and her expression conveyed a profound sense of offense at my mere presence. Her gaze swept over me, lingering with undisguised disgust on the faint smudges on my clothes and the general air of dishevelment that clung to me. "Honestly," she continued, her voice carrying a note of imperious impatience, "some people have absolutely no consideration for public hygiene. You look like you've been rolling around in the dirt. This is a grocery store, not a construction site." The sheer audacity of her judgment, delivered with such casual disdain, took me aback. I was tired, emotionally drained, and still carrying the invisible weight of the devastation I had just witnessed. Her concern for the pristine environment of the produce aisle felt jarringly trivial in comparison. "Ma'am," I said, my voice low and weary, "I apologize if my appearance offends you. I just got back from—" I hesitated, unsure if I wanted to divulge the details to this clearly unsympathetic individual. Karen cut me off with a dismissive wave of her hand. "Well, whatever you've been doing, you've brought half of it in here with you. Some of us actually care about maintaining a semblance of cleanliness in public spaces. You're tracking dirt everywhere. It's inconsiderate and, frankly, quite disgusting. You should really clean yourself up before coming out in public looking like that. It's simply not acceptable." The insult, delivered with such self-righteous conviction, hung in the air. The HOA Karen of Meadowbrook, oblivious to the selfless work I had just completed, was now chastising me for being too dirty. The irony and the simmering anger it ignited within me was almost unbearable. The stage was set for a confrontation where her superficial judgment would collide with the profound reality of my recent experiences. Karen's pronouncement hung in the brightly lit aisle, drawing a few curious glances from nearby shoppers. My initial weariness threatened to give way to a surge of anger. The sheer lack of empathy, the immediate judgment based on a superficial appearance, felt like a slap in the face after the grueling and emotionally taxing weeks I had just endured. "Ma'am," I began, my voice tighter than I intended, "I've been volunteering in Louisiana, helping people who lost everything in the hurricane. The dirt, as you call it, is the residue of that work." Karen's perfectly sculpted eyebrows arched slightly, but her expression remained largely unchanged. A flicker of something that might have been mild curiosity, but was more likely just a momentary pause in her self-absorption, crossed her face. "Volunteering, you say? Well, that's commendable, I suppose. But surely they have facilities for volunteers to clean themselves up. There's no excuse for bringing that filth into a public place." Her complete lack of understanding, the inability to grasp the sheer scale of the disaster and the rudimentary conditions under which we had been working, was astounding. We had been lucky to have access to occasional cold showers and had often slept in makeshift shelters, the concept of pristine cleanliness being a distant memory. "Ma'am," I said, trying to keep my voice level, "when entire towns are underwater and people are living in tents, personal hygiene isn't always the top priority. We did what we could, but the conditions were challenging." Karen huffed as if my explanation was a personal affront. "Well, I still maintain that you should have taken more care before returning home and subjecting the rest of us to that grime. It's simply inconsiderate." She wrinkled her nose slightly as if the very air around me was contaminated. At that moment, Mrs. Henderson, a kind elderly woman from my neighborhood who volunteered regularly at the local community center, walked past. She stopped when she saw me, her eyes widening with recognition. "Alex, you're back! Welcome home, dear! How was it down there?" Her voice was filled with genuine warmth and concern. She didn't seem to notice or care about the faint smudges on my face or the dust on my clothes. "Mrs. Henderson," I replied, a small smile finally breaking through my weariness. "It was intense, devastating, but the people there are so resilient." Mrs. Henderson reached out and gently squeezed my arm, her touch surprisingly strong. "We've been following the news. You're a wonderful young woman for going down there and helping. We're also proud of you." She glanced pointedly at Karen, a subtle disapproval in her kind eyes. Karen, clearly discomfited by this unexpected display of warmth and recognition, shifted uncomfortably. "Well, it's certainly admirable that some people have the time for such endeavors," she said, her tone dripping with thinly veiled sarcasm. "But as I was saying, there are still standards of public decency to uphold." Mrs. Henderson turned to Karen, her usual gentle demeanor hardening slightly. "Karen," she said, her voice surprisingly firm, "Alex has just spent 2 weeks helping people who have lost everything. A little bit of dirt is a small price to pay for that kind of selfless service. Perhaps a little empathy would be more appropriate than judgment." Karen's face flushed slightly. "Well, I just think—" But Mrs. Henderson cut her off. "Think about what that dirt represents, Karen. It represents hard work, compassion, and helping those in desperate need. It represents more humanity than I've seen from some people right here in Meadowbrook." With that, she gave my arm another squeeze and continued on her way, leaving Karen momentarily speechless. The brief but pointed exchange with Mrs. Henderson hung in the air. Several other shoppers who had overheard the conversation offered me quiet nods of support or murmured words of thanks. Karen, however, seemed unmoved, her initial judgment only slightly tempered by the social awkwardness of being called out. She eventually continued her shopping, her pristine white pantsuit a stark contrast to my dusty attire. As I continued to gather my groceries, I couldn't shake the feeling of frustration. The sheer disconnect between Karen's superficial concerns and the profound reality of the disaster zone was jarring. Over the next few days, as I slowly readjusted to life back home, the encounter with Karen lingered in my mind. I saw her a few times in the neighborhood, her perfectly manicured presence a constant reminder of her judgmental attitude. Each time she offered me a curt nod, her expression still conveying a hint of disapproval. The conflict simmered beneath the surface, a quiet tension between my recent experiences and Karen's unwavering adherence to her narrow worldview. I knew deep down that the irony of her judgment, her condemnation of my dirt, when that dirt represented selfless service, would eventually come to light. And I couldn't help but wonder how she would react when the full weight of her misjudgment finally dawned on her. The stage was set for a reckoning, a moment when Karen's superficiality would collide with the profound reality of human compassion and resilience. Life in Meadowbrook slowly returned to its predictable rhythm. The initial flurry of local news coverage about the hurricane relief efforts had subsided, replaced by the usual focus on school board meetings and community events. I settled back into my routine, catching up on sleep, reconnecting with friends, and trying to process the emotional weight of what I had witnessed in Louisiana. The physical grime had washed away, but the memories lingered. The faces of those who had lost everything, the resilience of the human spirit in the face of devastation, the overwhelming sense of community that had emerged amidst the chaos. The encounter with Karen Mitchell remained a sharp, unpleasant memory, a stark reminder of the superficiality that could exist even in the most well-meaning communities. I found myself consciously avoiding places where I might run into her, not out of fear, but out of a desire to not re-engage with her negativity. However, Meadowbrook was a small town, and our paths were destined to cross again. It happened at the local coffee shop, a place I frequented for a quiet morning latte. I was waiting in line, scrolling through news updates on my phone, when I heard her unmistakable voice, sharp and caring, engage in a rather animated conversation with the barista. And honestly, Karen was saying, her tone laced with her usual air of authority, the state of some people these days is simply appalling. The lack of personal hygiene is shocking. I encountered someone at the grocery store the other day who looked like they hadn't showered in weeks, tracking dirt everywhere. It's simply unacceptable in a civilized society. I froze, my blood running cold. There was no doubt she was talking about me. The details were too specific, the tone too familiar. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, a mixture of anger and humiliation. The barista, a young woman named Sarah, who was known for her friendly demeanor, offered a polite but somewhat non-committal, "Oh, really?" Karen continued, oblivious to the fact that the subject of her disdain was standing just a few feet away. "Yes, it was dreadful, and when I politely suggested they clean themselves up, they had the audacity to say they had been volunteering, as if that excuses such a lack of basic cleanliness. Honestly, some people use charity as an excuse for all sorts of slovenly behavior." The blatant hypocrisy of her statement, her self-proclaimed concern for societal standards, while displaying such a profound lack of basic human empathy, was infuriating. I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to confront her then and there. Just as I was steeling myself to speak, another voice intervened. Mr. Thompson, a respected elder in the community who knew me and my volunteer work, stepped into the line behind Karen. "Good morning, Karen," he said, his voice calm but carrying a subtle note of disapproval. "I couldn't help but overhear your comments. Were you perhaps referring to Alex? She just returned from volunteering with the Red Cross in Louisiana." Karen turned, her perfectly made-up face registering a flicker of surprise, quickly masked by a look of dismissive indifference. "Oh, good morning, Arthur. Well, if it was Alex, then I stand by my statement. While her charitable endeavors may be commendable, there's still no excuse for appearing in public in such a disheveled state." Mr. Thompson's eyebrows rose slightly. Disheveled? "Karen, Alex just spent 2 weeks helping people who have lost everything. She was working in incredibly difficult conditions. A little dirt is hardly a crime." Karen huffed. "Well, I just think—" But Mr. Thompson cut her off, his voice gaining a firm edge. "Think about the sacrifices people like Alex make, Karen. They put their own comfort and well-being aside to help those in desperate need. A little bit of dirt is a small price to pay for that kind of selflessness. Perhaps you should try focusing on the good she did, rather than the perceived imperfection of her appearance. The small coffee shop fell silent, all eyes on Karen. Mr. Thompson's quiet but powerful words hung in the air, a stark contrast to Karen's self-righteous indignation. Sarah, the barista, offered me a small, sympathetic smile. Karen's face flushed a deep red. She opened her mouth to retort, but then seemed to think better of it, likely realizing the unfavorable attention she was drawing. She huffed again, grabbed her coffee, and stalked out of the shop, muttering under her breath. Mr. Thompson turned to me, offering a warm smile. "Don't let her get to you, Alex. We all appreciate what you did down there." "Thank you, Mr. Thompson," I said, my voice still slightly shaky. His unexpected defense meant more than he knew. The incident at the coffee shop, while unpleasant, served as a catalyst. It solidified my resolve to not let Karen's superficial judgment define my experience. It also planted a seed of what I hoped would be her eventual realization of the profound error of her ways. The climax began to unfold a few days later. I was at home catching up on local news online when a headline caught my eye. Meadowbrook woman returns from Louisiana relief efforts. The article featured a brief interview with me, detailing my experiences and the ongoing needs in Cypress Creek Parish. The accompanying photo, taken shortly after my return, showed me looking tired but with a small, genuine smile, my face still bearing faint traces of the dust of Louisiana. Later that day, I received a text message from a mutual acquaintance, Sarah from the coffee shop. It read, "You won't believe who just came in here asking all sorts of questions about the hurricane relief efforts in Louisiana, and kept glancing nervously at the newspaper with your picture." A wave of grim satisfaction washed over me. It seemed Karen was finally beginning to connect the dirty person she had so readily judged with the reality of the disaster and the selfless work being done there. The final stage of the climax occurred the following morning. I was volunteering at a local donation drive for the ongoing relief efforts, sorting through donated clothes and supplies at the community center. The atmosphere was one of quiet purpose, neighbors helping neighbors, a stark contrast to Karen's self-absorbed negativity. The door to the community center opened and Karen Mitchell walked in. She looked different. Gone was the pristine white linen suit, replaced by a simple, slightly rumpled dress. Her usual perfectly coiffed hair seemed a little less structured, and her face, devoid of its usual heavy makeup, looked pale and somewhat anxious. Her eyes scanned the room, finally landing on me, sorting through a box of donated blankets. A look of utter shock and dawning comprehension washed over her face. The dirty woman from the grocery store, the subject of her disdain at the coffee shop, was here, actively involved in the very relief efforts she had so readily dismissed. Karen stood frozen for a moment, her mouth slightly agape. Then she took a tentative step forward. The woman who had so readily judged me based on my appearance was now confronted with the tangible evidence of the selfless work that had caused that appearance. The air in the community center crackled with the unspoken weight of her monumental misjudgment. The stage was set for a resolution, a moment when Karen would hopefully confront the profound error of her superficiality. The silence in the community center stretched, broken only by the soft rustling of donated clothing and the quiet murmur of volunteers. Karen stood just inside the doorway, her face a canvas of shock and dawning comprehension. The carefully constructed facade of pristine perfection had crumbled, revealing a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. Her eyes, wide and filled with a dawning horror, remained fixed on me as I continued to sort through the donated blankets. The contrast between my still slightly dusty appearance and the selfless act of organizing aid seemed to be a stark and undeniable truth she could no longer ignore. After a long moment, Karen took another hesitant step forward, her usual confident stride replaced by an almost tentative shuffle. She approached the table where I was working, her gaze never leaving my face. "Alex," she said, her voice barely a whisper, stripped of its usual sharp edge. I looked up, meeting her gaze. The anger I had felt during our previous encounters had softened, replaced by a quiet sense of weary understanding. The realization on her face was a more potent form of confrontation than any words I could have spoken. "Karen," I replied, my voice calm and neutral. She swallowed hard, her eyes welling up with tears. I saw the article. in the paper about your work in Louisiana. And then Arthur, Mr. Thompson, at the coffee shop. Her voice trailed off, choked with emotion. She took a shaky breath and continued, her words tumbling out in a rush of remorse. I am so sorry, Alex, for what I said at the grocery store, for what I said at the coffee shop. I had no idea. I was so judgmental, so unkind. You were doing something so important, so selfless, and all I could think about was dirt. Her face crumpled and she covered her mouth with her hand, her shoulders shaking. The sincerity of her remorse was palpable. The HOA Karen, who had so readily dispensed judgment based on superficial appearances, was now confronted with the profound shallowness of her own values. Several other volunteers had stopped what they were doing and were watching the interaction with quiet curiosity. Mrs. Henderson, who was sorting through canned goods nearby, offered me a knowing glance. I set down the blanket I was holding and looked directly at Karen, my voice gentle. Karen, what you said was hurtful, especially considering what we were doing down there. But I appreciate you saying you're sorry. Karen nodded, tears streaming down her face. It was more than hurtful. It was ignorant, cruel. I was so caught up in my own little world that I didn't even stop to think about what anyone else might be going through, or what that dirt might represent. She took another shaky breath. I I feel so ashamed. Is there anything I can do to help? Now? Here? Her gaze swept around the community center, taking in the boxes of donated goods and the busy volunteers. A small, genuine smile finally broke through my weariness. Actually, Karen, I said, gesturing to a box overflowing with unsorted clothes, we could really use some help sorting these by size. Karen didn't hesitate. She immediately stepped forward, her earlier pristine demeanor completely forgotten. She reached into the box and began to unfold a child's t-shirt, her movements surprisingly gentle. The rest of the morning unfolded with a quiet sense of shared purpose. Karen worked diligently alongside the other volunteers, her initial awkwardness gradually giving way to a focused determination. She didn't try to dominate or take charge. She simply followed instructions and contributed where she could. There were no grand pronouncements or dramatic displays of transformation, just a quiet woman, humbled by her own misjudgment, finding a small way to contribute to the very cause she had so readily dismissed. In the weeks and months that followed, a subtle but significant shift occurred in Karen's presence in Meadowbrook. The sharp edges of her HOA Karen persona seemed to soften. While she still maintained her meticulous standards for her own property, her interactions with neighbors became noticeably more empathetic and less judgmental. There were even whispers of her organizing a small fundraising drive for hurricane relief. I saw her occasionally at the community center, volunteering alongside others, her hands no longer perfectly manicured, but bearing the marks of practical work. She would offer me a quiet, respectful nod, a silent acknowledgement of the lesson she had learned. The resolution wasn't about a dramatic confrontation or a public shaming. It was about the quiet, internal shift that occurred within Karen when she was finally forced to confront the profound shallowness of her own judgment in the face of selfless service. And for me, it was a poignant reminder that even the most entrenched superficiality can sometimes be chipped away by the undeniable power of human compassion and the stark reality of human suffering.